I didn't become a teacher till the late 80s, after Section 28, but my teaching career then took place within the context of Section 28. I was active in the trade union movement, both before I'd become a teacher and when I was a teacher. So labour movement activism and political activism were part of how I looked at life, and you got strength from that. In the 1980s, a group of Conservative MPs amended the Local Government Act, which is the Section 28 of the Local Government Act, to introduce this discriminatory clause within the Local Government Act, because they were very wound up about some small tentative steps to make life better for gay and lesbian people, which were being introduced at local government level by the GLC, the Greater London Council. Consequently, Section 28 was part of the bill, and around the country there was opposition to that. There was a committee in Glasgow which I was part of, and we had a demonstration in Glasgow, which I think was the first lesbian and gay rights demonstration in Glasgow. Ian McKellen came and he spoke at it. That campaign was lost, and it was lost within the context of HIV and AIDS, which was having a terrible impact on the communities in the 1980s, and the loss of the miners' strike, which had not terribly long, a year or two prior to that, had been lost, which was a direct attack on the trade union movement and organised labour. It's all within a context of growing conservatism and the power of the Thatcher government. Margaret Thatcher herself spoke at Conservative Party conference about criticising the perceived inalienable right to be gay. She was contesting that, even that notion that people could had a right to be gay, as she phrased it. And what Section 28 did, it was very poorly phrased in legal terms, because the two MPs who'd led the insertion of this clause in the Act hadn't really taken enough time to get proper advice about how you would phrase and frame a much more stringent and restrictive section to the Local Government Act. So consequently, expressions like in promotion, the very word promotion, what that means in legal terms is very contestable. Presumed family relationship, again, open to all sorts of contestation around what that would mean. It was never properly tested in courts, and those of us that were opposed to it were also part of that. I didn't think it was a good idea to contest it in the courts, because if we had contested it, it might have been worse, because you then get legal precedent, because other court cases had all been lost. Anti-discrimination things around people being dismissed on grounds of being gay or lesbian had all been lost in the industrial tribunal. So consequently, the casework wasn't good, and their track record wasn't good, and the times weren't good in terms of the general social attitudes to gay and lesbian people were very reactionary, and the British Survey of Social Attitudes evidences that, how poor people's view of gay and lesbian people, and AIDS had made that worse. It is important to recognise that at that point there was no Equality Act. It was perfectly legal and reasonable, apparently, to dismiss a person purely on grounds of being gay or lesbian. That was perfectly legal in the 1980s. There weren't protections. The labour movement itself was very conflicted about gay and lesbian issues. When the second campaign came in, that was an entirely different political context. Scottish Parliament existed. Importantly, the Scottish National Party and the Labour Party were for repeal, and they were the two largest political groupings in the Scottish Parliament at the time. The Keep the Clause campaign had a very large financial backing, and had the backing of the Roman Catholic Church, which was at that point very powerful in Scottish public life. Church of Scotland was split. Some people were very much in favour of repeal, and some people were very much in favour of retaining the clause. So there wasn't a unified voice from the other major religious body, the Church of Scotland at the time. What maybe distinguished the Scottish campaign was the energy and vitality of the campaign to repeal, specifically amongst gay and lesbian people. It's something I saw in my life. The community activation was very, very high, because people at that point, my generation, were not prepared to go back to the way things had been in the 1980s, and how when we as younger people coming out in the 70s and early 80s, we knew the older generation, people who'd lived in the 50s and 60s, who had a much more harsher path in life, and we weren't prepared to go back to that. And I remember, I'm of a generation, I remember the decriminalisation of male homosexuality in Scotland, which is 1981, so that's relatively recently. Until that point, it was male homosexuality was a criminal offence, and that's a bizarre concept for people of a younger generation, but that's the way it was. Even after that, there was discriminatory practice in terms of marriage laws, in terms of age of consent, adoption, all sorts of things were highly discriminatory. And we knew that if Section 28, Clause 2A was retained in the statute book in Scotland around the year 2000, we would be pushed back into the harsher life of a previous generation. I was in Lesbian and Gay Switchboard in about 1980, and we obviously in Lesbian and Gay Switchboard advocated that people have a happy and fulfilled life, but technically that was an illegality for men in 1980, so we had to be careful even the way we phrased that. We were not necessarily encouraging people to break the law. What we were saying was, this is what I did, this is how I found my path to a more happy life. Even in Lesbian and Gay Switchboard in the 80s, there were training took place about how the advisors on lesbian and gay switchers should speak within the context of the criminalisation of male homosexuality. We also knew I knew older men and women who had been broken by the onslaught of discrimination and prejudice, fear about work, fear about tenancy, or having a fear about living with neighbours, all that kind of thing. And that exacerbated, again, through AIDS. Things went back the way through AIDS. One of the things that displays is things are never static, and that's got a positive and negative. One of the features of Lesbian and Gay Switchboard in 1980 was silent calls. Sometimes you would hear crying, you would hear somebody crying on the other end of the call, not being able to speak, and then it would click off. At some point, some of those people would come back on and talk, and some of those people would never come back. And then some people got the courage to phone, and maybe they would cry and not be able to speak, and eventually they would be able to speak, and eventually they would get further through the trauma which they were experiencing because of oppression. That helped form me. I understood what that was about. I think life has got much, much better for gay and lesbian people in Scotland. I have absolutely no doubt about that, because I know what it was like in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I know how people felt about themselves. I knew about oppression and repression, and I knew people, because I was on Lesbian and Gay Switchboard, I knew people were suicidal. I knew how desperate parents were who phoned up mothers and fathers because they discovered their kid was gay, and they were not so much homophobic as terrified of what life ahead for them would be like. Homophobia reverberated across society, but not at the level where the presence of a street lamp was something you were frightened of, and that was something I didn't know about. Complacency can be as dangerous sometimes as the actual repression and oppression, which fuels it. I was a head teacher, and I knew I could be an asset to the campaign because I could put a different point of view from the lies and distortion that were being circulated around about gay and lesbian people by the Keep the Clause campaign. But I suppose I also had gained strength from the community, and that was really important to me. I recall very vividly one of the things we did as part of the campaign, in the Scottish campaign. We created cards with a message for repeal, and we went out to bars which were gay bars where gay and lesbian people were out for a night out, and all the person had to do was sign it and put their postcode. We went away and we could trace that postcode and find out who their MSP was, and then we hand delivered hundreds and hundreds of communications from constituents about repeal. It was very gratifying, and it made you feel stronger. Was people in bars like Delmonico's in Glasgow, which still exists, people queued not to get in, but to sign the cards before they went in. I do not recall anybody ever refusing to sign one. They all wanted to sign them, and many people asked, can I take them away because my family wants to sign them? And I know from people who were working for MSPs that when those cards started to appear, the jittery MSPs who were a bit nervous because their post bags were filling up with keep the clause stuff, they started to relax because they then realised my constituents, I have now an evidence base that my constituents also want repeal. It's not just keep the clause people. So you get strength from the community, you get strength from allies, you get strength from people who want to support a decent way of changing things in Scotland. I recall going to the BBC studio on my own in a taxi and going into the kind of waiting room where you get coffee and tea, and there was maybe 6 people, because Keep the Clause was very well funded, so there was advisors, there was publicists, and there was me. You either approach oppression and repression with it's not happening, or I'm going under. You don't really have a kind of middle road in these situations. So when I get into the taxi to BBC Scotland, or I get into the taxi to go to Edinburgh, which is a very long taxi, I think it was the most expensive taxi at that point I'd ever been in my life, paid for by the BBC, to go to the Frost programme, the Breakfast with Frost. For me, it was a wee bit like that sort of young woman or young man in the 1960s walking through the street light. I was prepared to do it, and I think sometimes you've just got to do that. You've got to walk through that street light and walk through the door and get to a better place.